The silence that followed Delilah Vance's screams echoed louder than the gunshots that took her husband's life. Standing in the main street of Ordway, Colorado, in 1878, she watched the blood seep into the dust as her world collapsed around her. The doctor later said it was the shock that stole her voice. Others whispered it was grief that had locked her words away. Whatever the cause, Delilah hadn't spoken a single word in the month since Thomas was gunned down by rustlers outside their small homestead. At 24, she was already a widow. Her dreams of building a life and family with Thomas shattered like the store window that had been hit by a stray bullet during the attack. She moved through Ordway like a ghost, communicating with a small slate and chalk when absolutely necessary. The townsfolk regarded her with a mixture of pity and discomfort, never quite knowing what to say to the woman who couldn't respond. Sheriff Miller had promised justice, but the rustlers had disappeared into the vast Colorado wilderness, and the trail had gone cold. Delilah's farm was now too much for her to manage alone, her voice too absent to call for help, and her heart too broken to care. On this particular evening, as the summer sun cast long shadows across Ordway's Main Street, Delilah stepped out of Walton's general store with supplies that would last her another week of solitude. Her honey-colored hair was pinned severely under her bonnet, her blue dress faded from washing and wear. The joy that had once made her the brightest presence in any room had dimmed to nothing. The sound of a guitar caught her attention, an unusual occurrence in Ordway on a weekday evening. Despite herself, Delilah paused, grocery basket hanging from her arm as she turned toward the source of the melody. A stranger sat on a bench outside the saloon, his fingers dancing across guitar strings with practiced ease. His voice, deep but gentle, carried on the evening breeze, singing a mournful tune about lost love and new beginnings. A small crowd had gathered around him, but he seemed oblivious to their presence, lost in his own music. Delilah found herself drawn forward, her feet moving of their own accord. The man was unlike most cowboys who passed through Ordway. Though his clothes bore the dust of the trail and his face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, there was a quiet dignity about him. His boots were worn but well cared for, his shirt clean despite the day's heat. When the song ended, people dropped coins into his upturned hat and drifted away. Delilah remained, rooted to the spot, unsure why the music had affected her so deeply. Perhaps because it was the first thing since Thomas's death that had made her feel anything at all. The stranger looked up, noticing her lingering presence. His eyes, a striking shade of green, met hers with unexpected warmth. "Evening, madam," he said, his voice as melodic speaking as it had been in song. "Hope you enjoyed the tune." Delilah opened her mouth, then closed it, frustration washing over her face. She gestured helplessly at her throat, then shook her head. Understanding dawned in the stranger's eyes, but without the pity she had grown to detest. "Music speaks when words fail," he said simply, then patted the bench beside him. "Would you like to hear another?" She hesitated, then nodded, setting her basket down and carefully arranging her skirts as she sat beside him, maintaining a respectable distance. His fingers found the strings again, and he began to play a gentler melody, one that spoke of mountains and valleys, of hardship and hope. Delilah closed her eyes, feeling the music wash over her like cool water on a parched day. When she opened them again, she found the stranger watching her with a curious expression. "Name's Daniel Irwin," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Folks call me Danny. I'm passing through on my way to Denver looking for ranch work." Delilah reached into her pocket and withdrew her small slate, writing quickly before turning it toward him. "Delilah Vance," he read aloud. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Vance." She hesitated, then wrote again. "Widow, Danny's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam." She nodded, accepting his condolence with the same numb acknowledgement she'd given countless times in recent weeks. But something about Danny Irwin's sincerity made the words feel less hollow than they had from others. "Been a widow long?" he asked, setting his guitar aside. She wrote, "1 month." Danny winced. "That's mighty fresh grief, Mrs. Vance." Delilah stared at her hands, not knowing how to respond. The weight of Thomas's absence pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe sometimes. She'd been the talk of the town, not just for her husband's violent death, but for her subsequent silence. Dr. Henderson had examined her thoroughly and found nothing physically wrong with her vocal cords. "A manifestation of trauma," he declared with clinical detachment, as if putting a name to it might cure it. "I lost my brother 2 years back," Danny offered quietly. "Typhoid took him. I found that sometimes when the heart's too full of sorrow to speak, it helps to listen." Delilah looked up at him, surprised by his insight. "Would you permit me to play for you again tomorrow evening?" he asked. "Same time, same place. No obligation to do anything but listen." She considered his offer. She had no appointments, no obligations. Her days blended together in a monotonous haze of chores and memories. What harm could there be in listening to music? Slowly, she nodded. Danny smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Then I'll look forward to it, Mrs. Vance." As Delilah walked home to her empty farmhouse on the edge of town that evening, she realized the ache in her chest had eased slightly. For the first time since Thomas's death, she had something to anticipate. The next evening, Delilah found herself taking extra care with her appearance. She chose a dress that was still black for mourning, but had a small pattern woven into the fabric. She brushed her hair until it shone and pinned it less severely than usual. The changes were subtle. Anything more would have invited gossip in a town like Ordway, but they were deliberate. Danny was already at the bench when she arrived, his guitar across his lap. His face brightened when he saw her approaching, and he stood politely. "Mrs. Vance, I'm glad you came," he said, offering her the better portion of the bench. "I was thinking about what might please you today, and I recalled a song my mother used to sing. It's gentle, like a lullaby, but with hope woven through it." As promised, the melody he played was soft and sweet, reminiscent of childhood comforts and simpler times. Delilah found herself swaying slightly to the rhythm. Her eyes closed again as she allowed herself this small pleasure. When the song ended, she opened her eyes to find several passers-by had stopped to listen. They moved on quickly when the music ceased, but not before casting curious glances at Delilah and the stranger. She wrote on her slate, "Beautiful. Your mother taught you well." Danny smiled. She believed music was as necessary as bread. "My father thought it frivolous, but she insisted all 3 of us children learn an instrument." His expression grew distant for a moment. "My sister took to the piano, my brother the fiddle. I was the only one who wanted the guitar." Delilah wrote, "You play as if you were born with it in your hands." "Kind of you to say so," Danny replied, looking pleased. "Truth is, these fingers bled something fierce when I was learning, but some things are worth the pain." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the town's activities wound down for the evening. The mercantile was closing, shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks, families making their way home for supper. "Would you tell me about yourself, Mrs. Vance?" Danny asked eventually. "That is, if you wouldn't mind writing it." Delilah hesitated, then wrote, "Not much to tell. Came to Ordway 2 years ago with my husband. He's gone now." Danny nodded, not pushing for more. "Sometimes the shortest stories carry the most weight," he observed. "I've been wandering since my brother passed. Taking odd jobs, moving on when the restlessness takes hold. Music's the only constant companion I've kept, Delilah wrote. Why Ordway? Heard there might be work at the Carson Ranch outside town. Plus, the mountains looked inviting from a distance. He grinned. I'm a simple man, Mrs. Vance. A good view and honest work suit me fine. Delilah found herself wanting to smile back, though the muscles of her face felt stiff from disuse. She managed a small upward turn of her lips, which seemed to please Danny enormously. There's a hint of sunshine, he said softly. Been hiding behind those clouds a while, I'd wager. She looked down, embarrassed by his attention yet not displeased by it. Mrs. Vance, Danny said, his tone growing serious, I'd like to ask a favor. She looked up, questioning. Would you allow me to escort you home? The hour's growing late, and a lady shouldn't walk alone at dusk. Delilah considered his offer. Ordway was generally safe, especially for someone like her who had lived there long enough to be known. But something in her wanted to extend this interaction, to delay returning to her empty house for just a little longer. She nodded, writing. I live on a farm just outside town. I'd be honored, Danny said, standing and offering his arm in a gentlemanly fashion. As they walked together down Ordway's main street, Delilah was acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk they passed. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, actually stopped sweeping to stare openly at them. Delilah felt a flush rise to her cheeks but kept her gaze forward, her hand resting lightly on Danny's offered arm. Friendly town? Danny asked, seeming to notice the attention they were attracting. Delilah removed her hand briefly to write. Small town. News travels fast. Danny chuckled. Ah, I understand. By morning we'll be engaged in the gossip mill. She gave him a wry look that made him laugh outright. I meant no disrespect, Mrs. Vance. I'm well aware of propriety, just making light of human nature. They continued walking, leaving the town proper behind as they took the road leading to her farm. The evening was pleasantly cool after the heat of the day, with the scent of sage and earth carried on the breeze. I've been meaning to ask, Danny said as they walked. If it's not too forward your voice, has it always been? Absent, Delilah shook her head, then wrote, since Thomas died, doctor says it's shock. Danny considered this. And before, were you a woman of many words, she wrote. I sang in the church choir. This revelation seemed to affect Danny deeply. He stopped walking for a moment, looking at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. You were a singer, he said softly, not as a question but a confirmation. She nodded, then wrote, It doesn't matter now. With respect, Mrs. Vance, I believe it matters very much, Danny said. Music isn't just in the throat, it lives in the heart first. Delilah felt tears threatening for the first time in weeks. She'd been too numb to cry, even at Thomas's funeral. Now, this stranger's words were cracking the wall she'd built around her emotions. Seeming to sense her distress, Danny changed the subject, pointing to a hawk circling above the fields. Magnificent creatures, he observed. So free, yet so focused. Grateful for the reprieve, Delilah nodded, blinking away her unshed tears. They reached her farm as the sun was setting, painting the sky in dramatic oranges and purples. The modest house stood in stark contrast to the vibrant sky, its windows dark and uninviting. Thank you for allowing me to walk with you, Danny said, stopping at the gate to her property. And for listening to my playing today, Delilah wrote. Will you be at the bench tomorrow? Danny smiled. If you wish it, yes. She nodded, then impulsively wrote, What brings a man like you to wander? You could earn a living with your music in a bigger town. A fair question, Danny acknowledged. Perhaps the answer is another song for another day. He tipped his hat to her. Good evening, Mrs. Vance. Sleep well. Delilah watched him walk back toward town, his guitar slung across his back, his stride easy and unhurried. For the first time in a month, the farmhouse didn't seem quite as empty when she entered it. The next day, Delilah found herself watching the clock, an anticipation building that felt foreign after weeks of emptiness. She spent the morning doing chores that had been neglected, hanging fresh curtains, sweeping the porch, even picking a few wildflowers to place in a jar on the kitchen table. It wasn't much, but it was movement, action instead of the frozen state she'd been existing in. In town that afternoon, she noticed people watching her with renewed interest. Mrs. Peterson made a point of mentioning that the musical drifter had been asking about work at the livery stable, her tone suggesting there was more she wanted to know but wouldn't directly ask. Delilah ignored the implied questions, purchasing her supplies and heading to the bench earlier than the previous day. Danny wasn't there yet, and for a moment, she worried he might not come. But then she spotted him emerging from the barber shop, his face freshly shaved, his hair trimmed neatly beneath his hat. He smiled broadly when he saw her. "Mrs. Vance, you're early," he said, quickening his pace to join her. "I hope you haven't been waiting long." She shook her head, noting that he had put on a clean shirt and his boots had been polished. The effort wasn't lost on her. "I secured some work at the livery," he told her as he settled beside her on the bench, guitar in hand. "Nothing permanent, but Mr. Jennings needs help breaking some new horses. It'll keep me in Ordway a while longer," Delilah wrote. "You're good with horses." "I get along with most creatures," Danny replied. "Horses, dogs, even the occasional ornery mule, they respond to calm and consistency." He paused. "Much like people, I suppose." Delilah considered this, then wrote, "What song today?" "I thought something livelier," Danny said. "If that suits you," she nodded, curious to see what he had in mind. The melody he began was indeed more upbeat, a tune that spoke of adventures on the open range and the joy of freedom. His fingers moved faster across the strings, and his foot tapped against the boardwalk in rhythm. Despite herself, Delilah found her own foot moving slightly in time with the music. When he finished, she applauded silently, her hands making the motion without sound. Danny bowed his head in acknowledgement, looking pleased by her response. "Music should take us places," he said. "Sometimes to memories, sometimes to dreams," Delilah wrote. "Where did that song take you?" Danny's expression grew thoughtful. "To the first time I rode across the plains alone after my brother died. I was angry, confused, but the land has a way of putting things in perspective. Under that big sky, a man's troubles seem smaller." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The vastness of Colorado had been both intimidating and comforting when she and Thomas had first arrived from Missouri. "May I ask about your husband?" Danny ventured carefully. "Only if you wish to share, of course." Delilah hesitated, then wrote, "Thomas, farmer, kind man. Shot by rustlers trying to steal our horses." Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote the last part. Danny's expression darkened. "I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Vance. That's a terrible way to lose someone." She nodded, unable to write more about it. "Did they catch the men responsible?" he asked. She shook her head. Danny's jaw tightened briefly, but his voice remained gentle when he spoke again. "How are you managing the farm alone?" Delilah wrote. "Barely. Hired boy from town helps with heavy work, considering selling." "That's a difficult decision," Danny observed. "Land represents more than property, it's dreams and hopes made visible." She looked at him with surprise. For a drifter, he had an unusual understanding of attachment to place. "My father was a farmer," Danny explained, seeing her expression. "In Kentucky." "I grew up watching him pour his soul into those fields," Delilah wrote, "but you didn't stay." A shadow passed over Danny's face. "No, there was. A disagreement about my future." He shrugged, the motion not quite as casual as he tried to make it appear. Some paths diverge and never meet again. She sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, their private sorrows. "Mrs. Vance," Danny said after a moment, "would you consider showing me your farm properly sometime? I have experience that might be useful if you're struggling with the workload." Delilah tilted her head, considering his offer. It could be inappropriate to invite a single man to her property for anything other than strictly business purposes. Yet there was something about Danny Irwin that inspired trust, she wrote. Sunday after church, people would gossip less. Danny smiled, understanding her caution. "Sunday would be perfect. I'll attend services as well if that's acceptable." She nodded, then wrote, "You should know people are already talking. About us?" Danny asked, looking more amused than concerned. "Let them talk. Two people enjoying music together is hardly scandalous." Delilah gave him a look that suggested he was being naive. "All right," he conceded. "Perhaps in a town this size it constitutes high drama. Does it trouble you?" She considered the question, then wrote, "No, but my reputation is above reproach," Danny finished firmly. "You're a widow in mourning who's shown nothing but propriety. If anyone suggests otherwise, they reveal more about their own character than yours." His defense warmed something in Delilah that had been cold for too long. She wrote, "Thank you." "No thanks needed for speaking truth," Danny replied. Then, with a twinkle in his eye, he added, "Besides, I'm just a wandering musician passing through. What reputation have I to maintain?" This actually drew a silent laugh from Delilah, her shoulders shaking slightly with the effort. The sensation felt foreign, almost painful after so long without mirth. Danny watched her with evident pleasure. "There it is," he said softly. "A laugh suits you, Mrs. Vance." She composed herself, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I have a proposition," Danny said, changing the subject. "Each day, I'll bring you a new song. Different moods, different stories. Music can speak to parts of us that sometimes hide from words." Delilah wrote, "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Danny looked at her directly, his green eyes serious. "Because I recognized something in you from the first moment. A song that's been silenced but not lost." His voice dropped lower, gentle but firm. "Find your song again with me, Mrs. Vance. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday." Delilah felt tears threatening again, and this time she couldn't blink them away. One escaped, trailing down her cheek before she could catch it. Danny respectfully looked away, giving her a moment to compose herself. When she had wiped the tear away, he spoke again, his tone deliberately lighter. "Besides, I need the practice. Mr. Jennings says I can play at the livery in the evenings if I want to earn extra coins. Seems his horses appreciate good music," Delilah wrote. "Wise horses," which made Danny chuckle. "Indeed they are," he agreed. "Now, shall I walk you home again today? Or would you prefer I stay here to give the gossips less to chew on?" She considered, then wrote, "Walk with me. I don't care what they say." It was a small rebellion, but it felt significant. For weeks, Delilah had moved through life like a ghost, disconnected and drifting. Now, she was making a choice that might cause talk, and surprisingly, she found she didn't mind. "I'd be honored," Danny said, offering his arm once more. As they walked through town again, Delilah held her head higher. "Let them talk." For the first time since Thomas died, she felt something other than grief and emptiness. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but perhaps it was the first step toward remembering what happiness felt like. Sunday came, and Delilah found herself paying more attention to her appearance than she had in weeks. She chose her best black dress, the one with subtle lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair, which had begun to lose its luster during her period of grief, she washed the night before with rosemary water and arranged carefully under her bonnet. The church was nearly full when she arrived, as it always was in a town where Sunday service was as much a social occasion as a religious one. Delilah took her usual seat near the back, where she had been sitting since losing her voice. She used to sit closer to the front, near the choir, but those days seemed like another lifetime now. She was just settling in when she sensed someone approaching. Looking up, she saw Danny, dressed in a clean black suit that, while not new, was well maintained. He removed his hat as he approached. "Mrs. Vance," he said quietly, "would you mind if I joined you?" She gestured to the space beside her, aware of the eyes watching them from surrounding pews. Danny sat with a respectful distance between them, placing his hat on his knee. Reverend Thornton began the service with his usual call to prayer. Delilah bowed her head, but her thoughts were scattered, highly conscious of Danny beside her. When the congregation rose to sing, she remained seated, the familiar pain of loss washing over her anew. She had loved singing hymns, her clear soprano voice rising with the others in celebration and worship. To her surprise, Danny remained seated as well, though he hummed the melody very softly, almost inaudibly. The gesture touched her deeply, a small act of solidarity that required no explanation or acknowledgement. After the service, several townsfolk approached to greet Delilah, their curiosity about Danny evident in their expressions. Mrs. Peterson was the most direct. "Aren't you going to introduce your friend, Delilah?" she asked, her eyes gleaming with interest. Danny saved her the trouble of writing a response by extending his hand to Mrs. Peterson. "Daniel Irwin, madam. I'm working at the livery for a spell." "How nice, Mrs. Peterson replied, though her tone suggested she found it more intriguing than nice. "And how did you come to be acquainted with our Mrs. Vance?" "Music has a way of bringing people together," Danny replied smoothly. "Mrs. Vance has been kind enough to listen to my playing." This explanation, while true, did little to dampen the speculation in Mrs. Peterson's eyes. "Indeed. Well, we're always glad to welcome visitors to Ordway, especially those with musical talents." After several more such encounters, Delilah and Danny finally made their way outside. The day was gloriously clear, the Colorado sky a deep, impossible blue above the mountains that framed the valley. "Friendly congregation," Danny commented as they walked toward her farm. "Though I suspect we'll be the subject of after-dinner conversation in several households today." Delilah nodded, resigned to this reality. "Does it bother you?" he asked, studying her face. She hesitated, then shook her head. In truth, the gossip seemed less important than it might have before. What did it matter what people thought? Thomas was gone, her voice was gone, and her future stretched before her like an empty road. Danny's company provided a brief respite from that emptiness. When they reached the farm, Delilah led Danny on a tour of the property. The house was modest but solid, with a kitchen, a sitting room, and 2 bedrooms. The barn housed 2 milk cows, a plow horse, and several chickens. The fields, once carefully tended by Thomas, now showed signs of neglect despite the efforts of the local boy she hired occasionally. Danny assessed everything with a knowledgeable eye, asking questions that Delilah answered on her slate. He examined the plow, tested the pump at the well, and walked the perimeter of the fields, occasionally kneeling to inspect the soil. "You've got good land here," he said finally as they stood looking out over the property. "Rich earth, decent water access, your husband chose well." Delilah wrote, "He had dreams of making it prosper." "And now," Danny asked gently, she wrote, "now I don't know, too much for me alone." Danny nodded, understanding. "What would you do if you sold?" "Return east," Delilah shook her head firmly. Despite everything, Colorado had become home, she wrote. "Stay in Ordway, open a shop perhaps." "What kind of shop?" Danny asked, seeming genuinely interested. She wrote, "Millinery." I'm good with needle and thread." "I can see that," Danny said, glancing at the careful stitching on her cuffs, which she had altered herself. "You have an eye for detail." They walked back toward the house, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. "Mrs. Vance," Danny said as they approached the porch, "I'd like to make a proposition." Delilah looked at him questioningly. "I need steady work and you need help with this farm," he said. "I could stay on as your hired hand, help get the place back in order. Proper and above board, with me sleeping in the barn and you keeping your reputation intact." Delilah's eyes widened at his suggestion. It was practical, but also highly unusual. A single woman hiring a single man to live on her property, even with proper boundaries, would cause talk. As if reading her thoughts, Danny continued, "I know it's unconventional, but consider the alternatives. Selling a farm you might regret parting with or watching it deteriorate further." He paused. "I'm not asking for charity. I'd work hard for fair wages, and when you've decided what you truly want for your future, I'll move on if that's what's best." Delilah considered his proposal. It was true that the farm was becoming more than she could manage, even with occasional help. And Danny had shown himself to be respectful and hardworking in the short time she'd known him. She wrote, "People will talk. People always talk," Danny replied with a shrug. "Question is, do we give their opinions power over our decisions?" Delilah thought about Thomas, about how he had always encouraged her to be brave. "Don't let fear be your guide, Del," he'd say whenever she hesitated about something new. Would he want her to abandon their dream because of small-town gossip? She wrote, "When could you start?" Danny's face broke into a wide smile. "Tomorrow, if that suits you. I'll speak to Mr. Jennings today about finishing my time at the livery." Delilah nodded, feeling both nervous and relieved at her decision. It was practical, she told herself. Nothing more than a business arrangement between a widow and a hired hand. Yet as Danny tipped his hat to her in farewell, promising to return the next day with his belongings, Delilah couldn't help but wonder if she'd just changed the course of her life with a few words written on a slate. True to his word, Danny arrived early the next morning with his few possessions packed in a single trunk. He set up his quarters in the small room at the back of the barn, which had once housed seasonal workers when Thomas had bigger harvests. "This will do nicely," he assured Delilah as she showed him the space. "I've slept in far worse conditions on the trail." With the practicalities settled, Danny immediately set to work. He repaired the chicken coop that had been damaged in a recent storm, mucked out the barn, and began preparing one of the fallow fields for planting. Delilah watched from the house as he moved with purpose and efficiency, his experience evident in the way he handled the tools and animals. By midweek, changes were already visible around the farm. The sagging fence had been straightened, the garden weeded, and the water trough cleaned and repaired. Danny worked from sunrise to sunset, stopping only for meals, which Delilah insisted on preparing despite his protests that he could fend for himself. In the evenings, after supper was cleared away, Danny would bring out his guitar and play for Delilah on the front porch. True to his promise, each song was different, sometimes joyful, sometimes melancholy, sometimes telling stories of faraway places and adventures. On Friday evening, as they sat in the gentle twilight, Danny played a particularly haunting melody. When it ended, Delilah wrote, "What is that called?" "It doesn't have a name," Danny admitted. "I composed it myself these past few days." Surprised, Delilah wrote, "You write music too?" Danny nodded, looking almost embarrassed. "I try. This one?" He hesitated. "This one made me think of you." Delilah felt heat rise to her cheeks, unsure how to respond. "The melody came to me while I was mending the fence," Danny continued. "Something about the way you move through your days, quiet but purposeful. "There's sorrow there, but strength too," she wrote. "Play it again." Danny obliged, his fingers finding the strings with practiced ease. This time, Delilah closed her eyes, really listening to the nuances of the composition. It was beautiful in its simplicity, with an underlying current of resilience beneath the sadness. When he finished, she opened her eyes to find Danny watching her intently. "What did you hear?" he asked softly. Delilah took a moment to gather her thoughts, then wrote, "Hope, buried deep but still there." Danny's expression softened. "Yes," he said, "that's what I hope to capture." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell completely, the stars emerging one by one in the vast Colorado sky. It was Danny who finally broke the silence. "I should turn in," he said, rising from his chair. "Early start tomorrow. I want to finish that north field before the weather changes." Delilah nodded, standing as well. "Good night, Mrs. Vance," Danny said, his voice gentle in the darkness. "Thank you for the supper, and for listening." As she watched him walk toward the barn, his guitar slung across his back, Delilah realized that for the first time in months, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The weekend brought unexpected visitors. Sheriff Miller rode out to the farm on Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to check on Delilah's welfare but clearly curious about the new arrangement. "Heard you hired some drifter to help around the place," he said, standing awkwardly in her kitchen after declining her offer of coffee. "Just wanted to make sure everything's proper." Delilah's cheeks burned at the implication, but she wrote firmly, "Mr. Irwin is a respectable worker. He sleeps in the barn." The sheriff nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Well, if you need any protection, you just send word to town." After he left, Delilah found Danny repairing a harness, his expression troubled. "Sheriff paying social calls now?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. She wrote, "Making sure I'm safe, people talk." Danny sighed. "I expected as much. Does it bother you? If my presence is causing you distress, I can find work elsewhere." Delilah shook her head emphatically, then wrote, "This farm needs you. I won't let gossip chase away good help." Danny smiled at that, though the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "As long as you're sure, Mrs. Vance." On Sunday, they attended church together again, this time drawing even more attention than before. Reverend Thornton himself approached them after the service, his expression kind but concerned. "Mrs. Vance, Mr. Irwin," he greeted them. "I understand you've entered into an employment arrangement." Danny nodded respectfully. "Yes, Reverend. Mrs. Vance has been kind enough to hire me to help restore her farm." "A noble endeavor," the Reverend said. "I trust you both understand the importance of appearances." "Absolutely, sir," Danny replied seriously. "Mrs. Vance's reputation is of the utmost importance to me. I reside in the barn, and our interactions are entirely proper." The Reverend seemed satisfied with this response. "Good, good. The Lord calls us to be not only pure in deed but also in appearance." After he moved on, Danny escorted Delilah home in silence, both of them aware of the scrutiny they were under. As the weeks passed, however, the town's initial fascination with their arrangement gradually subsided as it became clear that Danny was exactly what he claimed to be: a hardworking hired hand, helping a widow maintain her property. His respectful behavior and Delilah's continued mourning dress eased most concerns about impropriety. Meanwhile, the farm began to flourish under Danny's care. The fields that had lain fallow were now planted with crops that would yield before winter. The animals were healthy, the buildings repaired, and there was an order to the place that had been missing since Thomas's death. Delilah found herself settling into a new routine. Her days were filled with household tasks, cooking for Danny, and tending to the chickens and garden. In the afternoons, She often sat on the porch, sewing or reading, while watching Danny work in the distance. Their evenings were spent in music, with Danny playing his guitar and occasionally teaching Delilah simple tunes that she could tap out on the table with her fingers. As summer turned to early autumn, with the aspen trees beginning to gild the mountainsides with gold, Delilah realized that something fundamental had changed within her. The crushing weight of grief had eased somewhat, making room for other emotions. She still missed Thomas deeply, still mourned the future they would never have, but the pain was no longer all-consuming. One crisp September morning, Delilah was in the kitchen kneading bread dough when she heard a commotion outside. Looking through the window, she saw Danny running toward the house, his face alight with excitement. "Mrs. Vance," he called as he burst through the door, forgetting formality in his enthusiasm. "Come quick, the mare's foaling." Without thinking, Delilah wiped her hands on her apron and followed Danny to the barn. The mare, a sturdy workhorse they had purchased in August when the farm began turning a small profit, was indeed in labor. Danny had prepared a clean stall with fresh hay, and now he knelt beside the animal, speaking to her in soothing tones. "She's doing well," he told Delilah, who stood watching with wide eyes. "First foals can be tricky, but she's strong." For the next hour, they remained in the barn together, Danny occasionally helping the mare while Delilah fetched water and clean cloths as needed. When the foal finally emerged, wet and wobbly, Delilah found herself holding her breath until the tiny creature took its first gasping inhalation. "A colt," Danny announced triumphantly, his face streaked with sweat and dirt but radiant with joy. "And a fine one at that." Delilah knelt beside him, watching in wonder as the mare began cleaning her newborn. The miracle of new life unfolding before her eyes touched something deep within her soul, a place that had been closed off since Thomas's death. "Beautiful, isn't he?" Danny asked, his voice soft with awe. Without thinking, Delilah nodded and whispered, "Yes." The sound that emerged from her throat was barely audible, rough from disuse, but it was unmistakably her voice. Both she and Danny froze, staring at each other in shock. "Mrs. Vance," Danny breathed. "You spoke." Delilah's hand flew to her throat, her eyes wide with surprise and confusion. "Try again," Danny encouraged gently, taking her hand. "Just one word." Delilah swallowed hard, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of her vocal cords preparing to work after months of silence. "Colt," she managed, the word emerging as a raspy whisper but clear enough to be understood. Tears filled Danny's eyes. "That's it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's your voice." Delilah found herself crying too, overwhelmed by the unexpected breakthrough. Months of silence broken by the simple miracle of new life. Danny squeezed her hand, his own shaking slightly. "Don't push yourself," he advised. "Your voice needs time to strengthen, like any muscle that hasn't been used." She nodded, understanding but impatient now that the barrier had been broken. She wanted to say so much, had been holding words inside for so long. "Beautiful," she whispered again, gesturing to the colt who was now attempting to stand on wobbly legs. "He is," Danny agreed, his smile wide and unguarded. "And so is this moment." They stayed in the barn until they were certain mother and foal were doing well, then returned to the house, both still stunned by what had happened. In the kitchen, Delilah's abandoned bread dough had risen too much and collapsed, but neither of them cared. Danny sat at the kitchen table while Delilah made tea, her movements automatic while her mind raced with the implications of finding her voice again. "Small steps," Danny cautioned when she brought the cups to the table. "Don't try to rush. Your voice will come back gradually." Delilah nodded, still reaching for her slate out of habit. She wrote, "What made it happen?" Danny considered the question. "Joy," he said finally. "Perhaps your heart needed to remember joy before your voice could return." It was a simple explanation, but it resonated with Delilah. The moment in the barn had been pure joy, unexpected, unplanned, and completely genuine. For those brief minutes, she had forgotten her grief entirely, focused only on the miracle unfolding before her. "Thank you," she whispered, meeting Danny's eyes across the table. "I did nothing," he replied modestly. "This was your journey." She shook her head, wanting to explain that he had done everything, brought music back into her life, helped her save the farm, shown her that joy was still possible. But the words were too many for her fragile voice, so she simply reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Danny looked down at their hands, then back up at her face, his expression a mixture of surprise and hope. "Mrs. Vance, Delilah," he said softly, "I don't want to presume." She squeezed his hand, unable to articulate the emotions swirling within her, but wanting him to know they were there. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Delilah withdrew her hand quickly, a flush rising to her cheeks as she went to answer it. Mrs. Peterson stood on the porch, a basket of preserves in her hands. "Good afternoon, Delilah," she said brightly. "I was passing by and thought you might enjoy some of my peach preserves." Her eyes darted past Delilah to where Danny could be seen sitting at the kitchen table, and her expression grew knowing. "I see Mr. Irwin is taking his midday meal with you. How convenient." Delilah felt a flash of irritation at the insinuation, but before she could reach for her slate, she heard herself say, "Danny helped deliver a foal this morning." Mrs. Peterson's mouth fell open in shock, not at the news of the foal, but at the sound of Delilah's voice. You spoke," she exclaimed. Delilah nodded, surprised by the ease with which the words had come this time. "This is miraculous," Mrs. Peterson cried, her previous suspicions forgotten in the face of this development. "When? How? Oh, the whole town will want to hear about this, Mrs. Peterson," Danny said, coming to stand beside Delilah. "Mrs. Vance's voice has only just returned and is still very fragile. Perhaps news of this could wait until she's stronger." Of course, Mrs. Peterson agreed, though her expression suggested the news would be all over Ordway by supper time regardless. But what wonderful tidings! The Lord works in mysterious ways indeed. After she left, promising to return soon for a proper conversation when Delilah was up to it, Danny turned to Delilah with an apologetic smile. "I fear the quiet phase of your recovery has just ended," he said. "By tomorrow, you'll likely have visitors lined up at the door." "It's all right," Delilah whispered, finding that speaking was becoming marginally easier with each attempt. "They mean well." Danny's expression softened. "They do, and they'll be genuinely happy for you." True to his prediction, word of Delilah's miraculous recovery spread through Ordway like wildfire. The next day brought a stream of visitors, from Reverend Thornton to Sheriff Miller to neighbors Delilah had barely spoken to even before losing her voice. Each visitor expressed amazement and joy at her recovery, though Delilah could only respond in whispers and short phrases. Dr. Henderson arrived uninvited, insisting on examining her throat and pronouncing her condition, a remarkable case of psychological mutism, now resolved. By evening, Delilah was exhausted from the attention, her newly awakened voice strained from the little use she had given it. When the last visitor finally departed, she sank into her rocking chair on the porch with visible relief. Danny, who had made himself scarce during most of the visitations, approached with a cup of tea. "Honey and lemon," he explained, handing it to her. "Good for the throat." "Thank you," she whispered, grateful for his thoughtfulness. Danny sat in the chair beside her, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Quite a day," he observed. Delilah nodded, sipping the soothing tea. Tomorrow may be quieter, Danny suggested. The initial excitement will fade. I hope so, Delilah managed, her voice barely audible now from overuse. Danny reached for his guitar, which he had left leaning against the porch railing. Rest your voice, he advised gently. Let me do the talking tonight in the only way I know how. The melody he played was soft and comforting, like a lullaby for a weary soul. Delilah closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, easing the tension of the day. When she opened them again, Danny was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. What? She whispered. I was just thinking, he replied, his fingers still moving over the strings, how remarkable you are. Delilah shook her head slightly, dismissing the compliment. You are, Danny insisted. To endure such grief, to lose your voice, to face an uncertain future alone, and yet here you sit, finding your way back to yourself one word at a time. Delilah felt tears threatening again. She had cried more in the past 2 days than in the previous 2 months. Not alone, she managed to say, holding his gaze steadily despite her emotion. Danny's fingers stilled on the guitar strings, the music fading into the evening air. No, he agreed softly. Not alone. They sat in silence as twilight deepened around them, each lost in thought, each aware that something significant had shifted between them, but neither quite ready to name it. The following week brought another unexpected development. Sheriff Miller arrived at the farm one morning, his expression grave as he dismounted from his horse. Mrs. Vance, he greeted Delilah, who was hanging laundry in the yard. I need to speak with you and Mr. Irwin if he's available. Delilah nodded, her newly recovered voice still too fragile for outdoor use. She gestured toward the barn where Danny was working, then led the sheriff to the house. Once they were all seated at the kitchen table, Sheriff Miller removed his hat and placed it beside him. I've received word from the sheriff in Pueblo, he began. They've apprehended a gang of rustlers operating in this region, 3 men, led by a fellow named Harlan Dodge. Delilah felt her heart begin to race. These could be the men who had killed Thomas. They've been operating between here and the New Mexico territory for over a year, Sheriff Miller continued. Stealing livestock, robbing travelers. They've killed at least 2 men that we know of. Thomas, Delilah whispered, her hand instinctively seeking Danny's under the table. Sheriff Miller nodded solemnly. We believe so, Mrs. Vance. One of the men has confessed to a killing matching the circumstances of your husband's death. Danny's hand tightened around Delilah's. Have they been charged? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. They're facing trial in Pueblo next month, the sheriff confirmed. Given the evidence and confessions, they'll likely hang. Delilah closed her eyes, absorbing this news. Justice for Thomas, something she had almost given up hope of seeing. Mrs. Vance, Sheriff Miller continued, you may be called to testify if you're willing, your voice permitting, of course. I will, Delilah said, surprising herself with the strength in her tone despite its softness. I want to see them. Sheriff Miller nodded, looking relieved. The trial begins October 15th. I can escort you to Pueblo when the time comes. After he left, Delilah and Danny sat in silence for a long moment. The news had brought Thomas's death back into sharp focus, a reminder of the grief that had nearly consumed her. Are you all right? Danny finally asked, his hand still holding hers. Delilah considered the question honestly. I don't know, she admitted, her voice slightly stronger than it had been the day before. I thought I wanted justice, but now it brings everything back, Danny finished for her, understanding in his eyes. She nodded. But I need to go, need to see their faces. Of course, Danny agreed, and I'll go with you if you'll allow it. Delilah looked at him gratefully. I'd like that. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Delilah worked daily to strengthen her voice, reading aloud to Danny in the evenings and singing simple songs as she went about her chores. By early October, though still softer than before, her voice had regained much of its clarity and range. The farm was thriving under their combined care. The colt, which they had named Phoenix, was growing stronger each day, his gangly legs becoming more coordinated. The fields Danny had planted were yielding a modest harvest, enough to see them through winter with some to sell. As the date of the trial approached, Delilah found herself increasingly reflective about the changes in her life. Thomas's death had nearly destroyed her, stealing not only her husband but her voice and her will to move forward. Yet somehow, in the midst of that darkness, she had found a new path different from what she had planned, but not without its own promise. And then there was Danny. He had come into her life as a stranger, become her employee, and now he was something else entirely. Something she wasn't quite ready to name, though she felt it growing stronger with each passing day. The evening before they were to leave for Pueblo, Danny and Delilah sat on the porch after supper. The October air was crisp, hinting at the winter to come, and the stars seemed especially brilliant in the clear mountain sky. "I've been thinking," Danny said, breaking a comfortable silence, "about what happens after the trial." Delilah looked at him questioningly. "Winter's coming," he continued, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "The major work on the farm is done for the season. You might not need a full-time hand until spring." A cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air settled in Delilah's chest. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice suddenly strained despite all her practice. Danny turned to look at her directly. "That depends," he said carefully, "on whether there's a reason for me to stay." Delilah felt her heart quicken. "The farm is not what I'm asking about," Danny interrupted gently. "Delilah, these past months have been. I've never stayed in one place this long since my brother died, never wanted to until now." She sat very still, afraid to hope, afraid to speak. "I know it's too soon," Danny continued, his voice low and earnest. "I know you're still healing, still finding your way back to yourself, and I would never presume to take Thomas's place in your heart." "Danny," Delilah began, but he held up a hand. "Please, let me finish. I need to say this before we face tomorrow." He took a deep breath. "I care for you, Delilah Vance, more than I ever expected to care for anyone again. And if there's any chance, any possibility that you might someday feel something similar for me, I'll stay. Not as your hired hand, but as someone who hopes to earn a place in your life." Delilah felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of grief this time. "I thought I would never feel joy again," she said softly, her voice steady despite her emotion. "After Thomas died, it was like part of me died too, not just my voice but my heart." Danny nodded, understanding in his eyes. "But then you came with your music and your kindness," she continued. "And slowly, so slowly I hardly noticed, things began to change. The world had color again. Food had taste. Music had meaning." "Delilah," Danny whispered, hope dawning in his expression. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. "I don't know if I'm ready for everything, but I do know that I don't want you to leave." Danny reached for her hand, his own trembling slightly. "That's enough for now," he assured her. "We have time. After tomorrow, after you've faced these men and closed that chapter, we can figure out the rest together." Delilah nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Tomorrow would be difficult, reopening wounds that had only begun to heal. But for the first time she could see beyond that moment to a future that held possibility and perhaps even happiness. "Sing with me," Danny asked softly, reaching for his guitar. "What song?" Delilah asked, wiping away her tears. "The one I wrote for you," Danny replied. "I've added words now. Simple ones, that I think you could manage." As the first stars of evening appeared above them, Danny began to play the melody he had composed months ago, the one that spoke of sorrow and strength and hope buried deep. And this time, as he sang of new beginnings and courage found in unlikely places, Delilah's voice joined his hesitant at first, then growing stronger, finding its way back to song just as her heart was finding its way back to life. The journey to Pueblo was long and tiring, but Delilah faced it with a determination that surprised even her. Sheriff Miller rode ahead of their wagon, occasionally dropping back to check on their progress or point out landmarks along the way. Danny drove the wagon with steady hands, his presence a comfort as they traveled further from the safety of the farm and closer to the confrontation that awaited. They spoke little during the journey, each lost in their own thoughts, but the silence between them was companionable rather than strained. They arrived in Pueblo as the sun was setting, checking into a modest hotel near the courthouse. Sheriff Miller arranged for Delilah to have her own room, with Danny in an adjacent one, propriety maintained despite their increasingly obvious attachment to each other. "The trial begins at 9 tomorrow," Sheriff Miller informed them as they parted for the night. "I'll come for you at 8:30. Alone in her room, Delilah sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what tomorrow would bring. She would see face to face the men who had taken Thomas's life. Would it bring closure as she hoped? Or would it simply reopen wounds that had only just begun to heal? A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Opening it a crack, she found Danny standing in the hallway, concern etched on his features. "I wanted to check on you," he said quietly. "Tomorrow won't be easy." "No," Delilah agreed, her voice soft but steady. "But it's necessary." Danny nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Try to rest," he advised. "And remember, whatever happens tomorrow, you don't face it alone." His words carried her through a restless night and into the morning, where she dressed with particular care in her best black dress, her hair arranged neatly beneath a modest hat. When she met Danny in the hotel lobby, his approving glance gave her an additional measure of courage. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived, the case having attracted considerable attention in Pueblo and surrounding areas. Sheriff Miller escorted them to seats near the front, where Delilah would have a clear view of the proceedings. As they waited for the judge to enter, Delilah felt Danny's hand cover hers briefly, a silent gesture of support. She took a deep breath, steadying herself for what was to come. The proceedings began with formal charges against the three men Harlan Dodge, Samuel Tern, and William Cutler, accused of multiple counts of theft, robbery, and murder. When they were led into the courtroom in chains, Delilah forced herself to look directly at them. Harlan Dodge, the leader, was a hard-faced man with cold eyes that showed no remorse. Samuel Tern was younger, perhaps no more than 25, with a nervous demeanor that suggested he might be regretting his choices. William Cutler, the largest of the three, had a brutish appearance and a defiant stance despite his shackles. As the prosecution presented its case, Delilah listened with growing certainty that these were indeed the men responsible for Thomas's death. The pattern of their crimes, the descriptions of their methods, all matched what had happened that terrible day. When it was her turn to testify, Delilah approached the witness stand with steady steps, though her heart pounded in her chest. The prosecutor guided her gently through her testimony, asking about the day Thomas died, what she had seen and heard. "They came at dawn," Delilah recounted, her voice soft but clear in the hushed courtroom. "Three men armed with rifles and pistols. Thomas went out to confront them when he saw them trying to take our horses." As she described the confrontation, the shots that rang out, finding Thomas bleeding in the yard, Delilah's voice remained steady, though tears threatened. She looked directly at the three defendants as she spoke, refusing to let them see her fear. "Can you identify any of these men as those present that day?" the prosecutor asked finally. Delilah nodded, pointing first to Harlan Dodge. "He was the one who gave the orders." Then to William Cutler. "He fired the shot that killed my husband." She hesitated at Samuel Turn, whose head was bowed. "I'm less certain about him, but the third man was approximately his build." The defense attorney tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting that her grief and the trauma of the event might have affected her memory, particularly given her subsequent loss of speech. But Delilah remained firm, answering each question with quiet dignity. When she was finally excused, Danny was waiting to escort her back to her seat. His face showed pride mixed with concern, and his hand at her elbow steadied her trembling limbs. The trial continued with additional witnesses: a store owner who had been robbed, a rancher who had lost cattle to the gang, a deputy from a neighboring county who had been tracking their movements for months. By the end of the day, the case against the three men seemed overwhelming. As they left the courthouse, Delilah felt a strange mixture of emotions: exhaustion, relief, and a lingering sorrow that no verdict, no punishment could erase. "You were very brave today," Danny told her as they walked back to the hotel, Sheriff Miller a discreet distance behind them. "It was harder than I expected," Delilah admitted, seeing them remembering. "But you did it," Danny said. "You stood up and spoke the truth. Thomas would be proud." The mention of Thomas's name didn't bring the sharp pain it once had. Instead, Delilah felt a gentle sadness, the kind that acknowledged loss without being consumed by it. "Yes," she agreed softly. "I think he would." The next day brought closing arguments and the jury's deliberation. By evening, they had returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts for all three defendants. The judge sentenced Harlan Dodge and William Cutler to hang. Samuel Turn, deemed less culpable, and having shown remorse during the proceedings, received 20 years in prison. As the courtroom cleared, Delilah remained seated, absorbing the finality of the judgment. Justice had been served, as much as earthly justice could address such a loss. Sheriff Miller approached, hat in hand. "Will you stay for the execution?" he asked solemnly. "It's scheduled for 3 days from now." Delilah looked to Danny, who remained steadfastly neutral, making it clear the choice was entirely hers. "No," she decided finally. "I've seen what I needed to see, witnessed them face judgment. What happens next, that's between them and God." Sheriff Miller nodded, seeming relieved by her decision. "We'll start back to Ordway tomorrow, then." That night, Delilah and Danny dined together in the hotel's small restaurant, both subdued but sharing a sense that a significant milestone had been passed. "What are you thinking?" Danny asked, noticing her pensive expression. Delilah considered the question. "That it's over," she said finally. "Not just the trial, but that chapter of my life. Thomas is gone and nothing can bring him back, but his killers have faced justice, and now you can truly begin to look forward," Danny finished for her when she hesitated. "Yes," she agreed. "It's time to think about the future, not just survive each day." Danny's eyes held hers across the table. "And what do you see in that future, Delilah?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning and possibility. Delilah took a deep breath, knowing her answer would change everything. "I see the farm," she began slowly. "Not just surviving, but thriving. I see myself regaining my strength, my voice, my joy in living." She paused, then added softly, "And I see you, Danny, if you want to be part of that future." Danny's hand reached for hers across the table, propriety forgotten in the emotion of the moment. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "And nothing I want more than to build that future with you." They returned to Ordway the next day, the journey home feeling somehow shorter and lighter than the outward trip had been. As they approached the familiar outline of the farm, Delilah felt a surge of emotion, not just relief at returning, but genuine happiness at the sight of her home. The following days established a new rhythm to their lives. Danny continued to work the farm, but now there was an acknowledged shift in their relationship. They began to plan together, discussing which crops to plant in spring, whether to expand the chicken coop, how to invest the small profit they had begun to show. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, sometimes in companionable silence, sometimes with Danny playing his guitar while Delilah sang along, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. On Sundays, they attended church together, ignoring the occasional raised eyebrow or whispered comment. Most of the town had accepted their partnership, especially after witnessing Delilah's recovery and hearing about her courageous testimony at the trial. As winter approached, bringing the first snows to the Colorado mountains, Danny raised a question that had been on both their minds. The sleeping arrangement, he began awkwardly one evening as they sat by the fire. With winter coming, the barn will be mighty cold. Delilah nodded, a blush rising to her cheeks despite the months they had spent in each other's company. People will talk if I move into the house, Danny continued. Unless, Delilah prompted when he hesitated. Danny set aside his guitar and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. Unless I move in as your husband, not your hired hand. Delilah's breath caught in her throat. Though they had acknowledged their feelings for each other, neither had spoken of marriage until now. I know it hasn't been a year since Thomas passed, Danny said hurriedly, and if you think it's too soon, I understand. But Delilah, I love you. I think I've loved you since that first evening when you sat listening to my music, your eyes full of sorrow, but still seeing me, really seeing me when most people just look through a drifter like me. Danny, Delilah whispered, her voice full of emotion. I don't have much to offer, he continued earnestly. No family name, no fortune, just these hands, this heart, and a promise to spend every day trying to make you happy. Delilah placed a finger gently against his lips, stopping his words. You've already given me back my voice, she said softly. You helped me find my song again when I thought it was lost forever. Danny's eyes searched hers, hope and uncertainty battling in his expression. Yes, Delilah said simply. I will marry you, Danny Irwin. The joy that spread across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He rose, pulling her to her feet and into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength. I'll make you happy, he promised, his forehead resting against hers. Every day, I'll try to make you happy. You already do, Delilah assured him, her arms around his neck, her voice stronger than it had been in months. They were married 2 weeks later in Ordway's small church, with Reverend Thornton officiating. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with most of the town in attendance despite the short notice. Some had questioned the timing, but seeing the couple together, their happiness evident in every look and word, few could doubt the rightness of their union. Delilah wore a dress of deep blue rather than white, acknowledging her previous marriage while still making this day distinct and special. Danny, in a new suit purchased for the occasion, looked at her with such adoration as she walked down the aisle that several of the ladies in attendance dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. When it came time for the vows, Delilah's voice rang clear and true through the church, no longer a whisper but full of confidence and joy. As they exchanged rings, simple bands that Danny had ridden to Pueblo to purchase, Delilah felt Thomas's memory as a gentle presence, not a shadow. He would have wanted her to be happy to find love again. The winter that followed was the happiest of Delilah's life. The farmhouse, once so empty and silent, now echoed with music, conversation, and laughter. Danny moved his few possessions from the barn to the main bedroom, and they settled into married life with a naturalness that surprised them both. They worked side by side during the day, maintaining the farm through the winter months, planning for spring planting, caring for the animals. In the evenings, they would read aloud to each other, play music, or simply talk, making up for all the words Delilah hadn't been able to speak during her months of silence. As the snows began to melt, and the first signs of spring appeared on the Colorado landscape, Delilah shared news that brought Danny to his knees beside her chair, his face pressed against her still flat stomach in wonder and gratitude. "A baby," he whispered, looking up at her with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Our baby." "Due in late autumn," Delilah confirmed, her own eyes shining. "A new life to celebrate as we mark a year together." Danny rose, gathering her carefully into his arms as if she had suddenly become fragile. "Are you happy?" he asked, searching her face. "Truly happy." Delilah's smile was answer enough, but she gave him words as well, her voice strong and clear. "Happier than I ever thought possible again," she assured him. "You gave me back my voice, my music, my joy in living. And now you've given me this new life to love." "We gave each other these gifts," Danny corrected gently, his hand caressing her cheek. "Two broken souls who found wholeness together." As spring turned to summer, and summer to early autumn, Delilah bloomed with her pregnancy. The farm prospered under their combined care, yielding a harvest abundant enough to see them through the winter with plenty to sell in town. Danny's music continued to be a central part of their lives. He had begun composing more regularly, creating lullabies for their unborn child and love songs for Delilah. On Saturday evenings, he often played at the newly opened hotel in Ordway, earning extra money and bringing joy to travelers and townsfolk alike. Delilah joined him when she could, her voice now fully recovered and more beautiful than ever. Together, they created harmonies that brought tears to the eyes of their listeners, songs of love found, lost, and found again, of hope reborn from the ashes of despair. Their son was born on a crisp October evening, exactly 1 year after Danny had proposed. They named him Thomas Daniel Irwin, honoring both the past and the present, acknowledging the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect joy. As Delilah held their son in her arms, with Danny beside her, his face alight with wonder and love, she found herself singing softly the lullaby Danny had composed months earlier, its melody gentle and hopeful. "Find your song, little one," she whispered between verses, her voice clear and strong, filled with all the emotion that had once rendered her mute. "Find your song and sing it proudly, as your father taught your mother to do again." Danny's arm tightened around her shoulders, and he joined his voice to hers, their harmony a promise to their child and to each other, a promise of music, of love, of a future built note by note, word by word, day by day together. In the years that followed, the Irwin farm became known throughout the region not only for its prosperity, but for the music that flowed from it like a clear mountain stream. Danny and Delilah added to their family a daughter born 2 years after Thomas, whom they named Elizabeth after Danny's mother, and another son 3 years after that. The silence that had once defined Delilah's grief became a distant memory, replaced by the joyful noise of children playing, Danny's guitar and her own voice singing lullabies, teaching hymns to their children, and still, occasionally, performing with Danny in town. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Danny would take out his guitar and play that first melody he had composed for her. And Delilah would sing along, her voice blending with his in perfect harmony, finding her song again and again in the life they had built together.